Maxwell Thorne stared at his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, Manhattan's lights twinkling behind his silhouette. The bet still echoed in his mind, Preston's words swimming through the 3 martinis they'd shared at the club. "You've lost touch, Max. You have no idea how the other half lives. That's ridiculous. I started with nothing. That was 20 years ago. Now, you wouldn't last a month living like a regular person, let alone someone who's truly struggling." Max had scoffed, swirling his drink. "Try me." "All right." Preston's eyes had lit up with that dangerous gleam Max knew too well. "Marry someone homeless. Live with them. 1 year. No cheating, no secret luxuries. You do that, I'll donate $50 million to your foundation. And if I fail, same amount. My foundation." Now, watching his city spread out before him, Max wondered if he'd finally let his ego write a check his pride couldn't cash. His assistant Rachel's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your 4 o'clock is here. Send them in." Max turned, straightening his tie. He had interviews scheduled with several homeless women today, all pre-screened, background checked, and briefed on the situation. He'd insisted on full transparency about the bet. The last thing he needed was a lawsuit. The woman who walked in wasn't what he expected. She wore clean but worn clothes, her gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Her eyes met his directly, no shuffle, no downward gaze. "Grace Foster," she said before he could speak, extending her hand. Her grip was firm. "And I think this whole thing is ridiculous." Max blinked. "Excuse me?" "Your bet. This situation. Using people's hardship as some kind of billionaire boys club game." She sat without being invited. "But $50 million could help a lot of people. So here I am." Max found himself sitting too, intrigued despite himself. "You're rather direct. I've been homeless for 8 months. Before that, I had a master's in library science and a job I loved. Budget cuts, medical bills, and a landlord who doubled the rent can happen to anyone." She pulled out a folder. "Here's my resume, references from the shelter where I volunteer, and a proposal for how that $50 million could be used. You came prepared. Unlike some people in this room, I don't have the luxury of winging it." Grace's smile held no warmth. "So, should we discuss terms? Or would you prefer someone more?" She glanced around his office, appropriately grateful. Max leaned back, studying her. This wasn't going according to his mental script at all. "Tell me about your proposal," Max said, reaching for the folder. "First, tell me why you really took this bet." Grace crossed her arms. "And don't give me that ego nonsense. A man like you doesn't risk a year of his life over wounded pride." Max's fingers stilled on the paper. Nobody had asked him that, not even Preston. He'd been too busy defending himself, proving himself, to examine his own motives. "I suppose," he said slowly, "I wanted to prove I hadn't changed. That success hasn't made me." He trailed off. "Soft? Out of touch? Another rich jerk who thinks writing checks absolves him of understanding the problems he's trying to solve?" Her voice softened slightly. "At least you're honest about it." The wedding was small and practical, held at City Hall with Preston and Rachel as witnesses. Grace wore a simple blue dress she'd bought at a consignment shop. Max had offered to buy her something new. "Save it," she'd said. "That money could feed a family for a month." Now, standing in front of the judge, Max felt strangely nervous. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, a year-long contract with clear terms. So why did Grace's quiet, "I do," make his chest tighten? The judge pronounced them married. No kiss, no rice, no celebrations. Just Preston's knowing smirk and Rachel's worried glance as they signed the papers. "Ready to see your new home?" Max asked as they left the building. Grace adjusted her small backpack. "Lead the way, husband." Their new home was a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens, modest by New York standards, but still far better than most. Grace walked through it silently, running her fingers along the worn kitchen counter. "I chose something realistic for a middle-class couple," Max explained, watching her. "The terms say we can't live in luxury, but they don't require extreme." It wasn't the kind of love he'd known before, the carefully calculated relationships of his past, where both parties understood the social transaction taking place. This was messy and inconvenient and terrifying. "You're thinking too loud," Jenny said, from her homework spot on the floor. She'd become a permanent fixture in their home, the first of many strays Grace had taken in. "How do you tell someone that what started as a bet became real?" Max asked. Jenny rolled her eyes. "Maybe try using actual words. Just a thought." Grace came home to find Max attempting to cook dinner alone, No burning this time. He'd been practicing in secret during his lunch breaks. "What's the occasion?" she asked, dropping her bag by the door. "I need to tell you something." He turned off the stove, wiped his hands, faced her. "The bet ends in 5 months. I'm aware." Her voice was carefully neutral. "When it does, I don't want to go back to my old life." The words tumbled out before he could second-guess them. "I don't want this to end." Grace went very still. "This being?" "Us. The shelter work, all of it. But especially us. And I know I have no right to ask given how this started, but—" "Max," she interrupted softly. "Stop talking." Then she kissed him. They didn't tell anyone at first, letting their new reality settle between them like a secret. The twin beds were pushed together. Their morning routine shifted from careful avoidance to casual intimacy. But the biggest change was in how they worked together. The shelter program expanded. Max used his business experience while respecting Grace's ground-level knowledge. She taught him to listen to people's stories instead of just their problems. Together they built something neither could have managed alone. "You know what the worst part is?" Grace said one night, curled against him. "Preston's going to be insufferably smug about this." Max laughed. "He planned this whole thing, said he was tired of watching me waste my potential on vanity projects. Remind me to thank him, after I yell at him for treating people's lives like chess pieces." When the year was up, they held a meeting in Max's old office. Preston sat across from them, contract in hand. "Well," he said, "I believe you fulfilled all terms of the bet. The $50 million will be transferred to your foundation immediately." "Actually," Max said, "we have a counterproposal." Grace pulled out a folder, just like she had a year ago. "We've established a new nonprofit, equal partnership focused on sustainable housing solutions and education programs. We like the money to go there instead," Max finished, "along with matching funds from my personal accounts." Preston leaned back, smiling. "And the marriage?" Grace's hand found Max's under the table. "That's not up for negotiation." They moved to a modest house in Queens, big enough for their expanding shelter program, but small enough to keep them grounded. The master bedroom became theirs for real this time. No pretense of separate spaces needed. Jenny was their first official foster child, though they'd been functioning as her parents for months already. Grace handled the paperwork with her usual efficiency, while Max learned that being a father meant more than providing financially. "Did you ever think this would happen?" he asked Grace one evening, watching Jenny and 2 other teens do homework at their kitchen table. "When you walked into my office that day, I thought you were an arrogant rich guy who needed a lesson in humility." She smiled, leaning against him. "I just didn't expect to fall in love while teaching it." Their first anniversary dinner was interrupted by a crisis at the shelter. They ended up eating takeout on the floor of their office, solving problems and making calls until midnight. "Sorry about ruining the romantic evening," Grace said, as they finally headed home. Max pulled her close as they walked. "Are you kidding? This is exactly who we are. Who we chose to be." The streetlights caught the gray in her hair, more prominent now than when they'd met. He loved it, loved every line on her face, every fierce opinion, every moment she challenged him to be better. "Besides," he added, "we can celebrate tomorrow. Tomorrow's the shelter budget meeting. The day after?" She laughed. "Youth counseling program launch. Sometime this month. Now, you're getting it." Life settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Max still owned his company, but ran it differently now, focused on ethical practices and community impact. Grace reopened the library branch that had closed, turning it into a combination library and community center. Their home remained a haven for those who needed it. Some stayed for days, others for months. Jenny graduated high school and started college, but her room stayed ready for her visits. "We're not saving the world," Grace would say when Max got frustrated with the slow pace of change. "We're just trying to make our corner of it a little better." Preston became a regular at their Sunday dinners, though he complained about the folding chairs and paper plates. "You could at least upgrade the furniture," he'd grumble. "And deprive you of your penance?" Grace would tease. "Never." 2 years after the bet that started it all, Max found himself back in his old office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. But this time, he wasn't alone. "Penny for your thoughts?" Grace asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Just thinking about how differently I see it all now." He turned to face her. "I used to look at these lights and see power, success, money. Now I wonder about the stories behind each window, the people who need help, the ones we might be able to reach." "Careful," she smiled. "Your humanity is showing." "Terrible habit. I blame my wife." "Good," she said, pulling him toward the door. "Now come on. Jenny's making dinner, and you know how she gets when we're late." They walked home instead of taking a cab, something the old Max would never have done. The city felt different on foot, more real, more immediate, full of the kind of details you miss behind tinted windows. "You know what the best part is?" Max said as they neared their neighborhood. "Nobody won that bet." Grace raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure?" "Preston bet I couldn't live like a regular person for a year. But that's not what happened. You never let me just play at being normal. You pushed me to be better, to do more, to really understand. So you're saying we both won?" Max stopped walking and pulled her close. "We did better than that. We found something worth more than winning." Grace smiled and kissed him under the streetlight, while around them, their city hummed with possibilities. "It's fine," she cut him off. "But that second bedroom you're using as an office? It needs to become a shelter overflow space." "That wasn't part of the deal." "No, but it's part of who I am." She turned to face him. "You get to prove whatever point you're trying to prove. I get to keep helping people. That's my term." Max opened his mouth to argue, then remembered her words from their first meeting. "All right," he said instead. The first month was awkward. Max learned quickly that his definition of basic living needed serious adjustment. Grace questioned every expense, every habit, every assumption he'd developed over 2 decades of wealth. "You don't need paper towels when washable cloths exist," she'd say, or, "That coffee habit of yours could pay someone's electric bill." But it was the nights that truly tested him. Their shared bedroom had 2 twin beds, his idea of maintaining appropriate boundaries. Yet he found himself lying awake, listening to her breathe, wondering about the life she'd had before, the woman who'd earned a master's degree and lost everything. One night, he heard her crying softly and discovered that knowing what to do with someone else's pain was harder than any business deal he'd ever made. "You don't have to just lie there pretending to sleep," Grace said one night, her voice thick with tears. "I know you're awake." Max sat up slowly. "I didn't want to intrude." Funny choice of words for someone who married a homeless woman on a bet, but there was no bite in her tone, just exhaustion. "Today would have been my mother's birthday. She died last year. That's what started all this. The medical bills, I mean." Max swung his legs over the side of his bed. "Tell me about her." In the dim light from the street lamp outside, he saw Grace smile. She was a librarian too, used to say books were cheaper than therapy and twice as effective. "Is that why you became one?" I became one because she showed me that helping someone find the right book at the right moment can change their life. Their first real fight came 3 months in, when Max instinctively tried to solve a problem by throwing money at it. One of their shelter overflow guests, a teenage runaway, needed dental surgery. "You can't just write a check." Grace's voice filled their small kitchen. "We're supposed to be living on a realistic budget. So we let her suffer because of some arbitrary rule? No, we help her navigate the free clinic system and Medicaid application process, like everyone else has to do." Grace slammed a cabinet door. "You still don't get it, do you? Money isn't always the answer. Sometimes people need to learn how to solve problems without it. And sometimes immediate help is better than a lesson in bureaucracy." Max shot back. They glared at each other across the kitchen island, both surprised by their own intensity. They compromised. Max helped with immediate pain medication while Grace guided the girl through the system. Watching Grace spend hours on hold, fighting through paperwork, and refusing to give up taught Max more than any charity gala ever had. The girl Jenny started spending more time in their apartment even after her dental work was done. She'd help Grace cook dinner while Max attempted to learn, usually with disastrous results. "How did you survive before?" Jenny asked one night, watching him burn yet another pot of pasta. "Restaurants. Personal chef. Takeout." Max scraped blackened noodles into the trash. "Typical," Grace said, but she was smiling as she took over the cooking. "At least you're trying now." That word, trying, had become the theme of his life. Trying to understand, to adapt, to be something more than the man who'd made that bet. 6 months in, Preston visited to check on their compliance with the bet's terms. Grace served him coffee in their chipped mugs while homeless teenagers did homework at their kitchen table. "This isn't exactly what I had in mind," Preston said, eyeing the makeshift shelter their apartment had become. "No," Max agreed, watching Grace help one of the kids with math. "It's better. You've changed, old friend." Max thought about his designer suits hanging in storage, his sports car sold, his old life packed away. He thought about Grace's fierce dedication to helping others, her practical wisdom, her unexpected laugh when something genuinely amused her. "Yes," he said simply. I have. Preston studied him over the rim of his coffee mug. You're not just playing along anymore, are you? The next day, while Grace was at her new part-time library job, Max sat in their tiny living room and faced an uncomfortable truth. Somewhere between the arguments about budgets and the late-night conversations, between learning to cook and watching her fight for every person who came through their door, he'd fallen in love with his wife.